May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. So, if you've ever watched a war movie with a scene in the surgeon's tent, or seen an episode of a medical drama where a big disaster happens, you've seen triage in action. Triage being the idea that when time and skilled personnel are in short supply, doctors should first treat the folks for whom immediate medical care seems likely to make the difference between death and life, before helping those who will probably die or probably live no matter what treatment they receive. And although triage is specifically for setting priorities during medical emergencies, a similar thought process applies anytime an individual or organization wants to meet a need but does not have sufficient resources of time, money, or energy to meet that entire need. And when we think in terms of triage and prioritizing, Jesus' actions in today's gospel reading seem kind of frustrating and counterintuitive. Now, although this is fairly early in his public ministry, Jesus has already gained a significant reputation as a healer, such that when he travels openly, crowds of the sick press upon him in the hope of touching him and being made well. And because of this reputation, a man named Jairus approaches Jesus on behalf of his 12-year-old daughter, who lies at the point of death. Now, given that he's a religious leader and lives in an era where women were usually considered little more than property, we would expect Jairus' priorities to be different. Namely, that we'd expect him to want to get Jesus out of town as quickly as possible, so he stops disturbing the flock. And Jairus would want to expend as few resources as possible on a girl. But instead, he seeks Jesus out in the hope that Jesus will save his daughter. And Jesus agrees and begins walking across town, and a crowd follows. And among the crowd is a poor woman who for the last dozen years has been bleeding far more often than once a month, making her ritually unclean all the time, in addition to her physical suffering. And she's spent all her money in futile attempts to find healing. Having faith that contact with Jesus' clothes would solve her problem, she pushed through the crowd, touched his cloak, and was made well. And this is the point where Jesus deviates from the principles of triage. Instead of continuing with all haste to the dying girl, he stops and asks the person he inadvertently healed to come forward. And the woman does, and she tells Jesus her whole story, and he sends her forth with his blessing. But unfortunately, while he was talking to this woman, Jairus' daughter died. And the messengers figured the healer shouldn't bother going on. But Jesus told the girl's father to believe, just as the woman had faith. And when Jesus got to the house, he told the girl to get up. And to the amazement of her parents and the disciples, she did. And in a vacuum, it's a heartwarming scene. But the way Mark tells it, we may find ourselves thinking like Martha in the Gospel of John, who after the death of Lazarus told Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And as with that story, all's well that ends well. But it's hard not to wonder if Jesus could have spared this girl from the pain of death had he not stopped to talk to the formerly hemorrhaging woman. And so it's hard not to think that Jesus got his priorities wrong by not proceeding to Jairus' house with all possible speed. But because this is Jesus we're talking about, we have to ask ourselves if the problem is not with Jesus' priorities, but with ours. After all, in our modern understanding of triage, neither the girl nor the woman would be an especially high priority, because someone already at the point of death is unlikely to survive even with the best medical attention. And someone with a chronic but not fatal condition would only see the doctor after everyone who might not survive that day. And yet Jesus treats the chronic hemorrhage before proceeding to heal the fatal sickness. And in contrast to our American medical system, where the rich receive preventative care while the poor wait in emergency rooms, Jesus takes care of the poor woman ahead of the rich man's daughter. And in a situation where we've been trained to assume that you have to choose one patient or the other, Jesus takes all his time and still manages to save both. Now, on one level, it's a fool's errand to ask what kind of lessons we, who entirely lack the power to miraculously heal, might learn from how Jesus performed triage with the hemorrhaging woman and Jairus' daughter. But at another level, I believe we can apply what he did to the triage that we do as a society. In healing the poor woman who suffered 12 years before the rich girl at the point of death, Jesus might well indicate to us that we should prioritize caring for the poor over the rich, that we should not heal the acute afflictions of the well-off without also addressing the years of chronic homelessness, hunger, anxiety, and untreated illness that those with fewer resources have suffered. And applied more broadly, this might well mean that as cities, states, and a nation, Jesus would have us put more money into health care, shelter, social services, and other means of caring for the poor, and less money into lowering the taxes on the rich. But if applying this gospel story to our societal priorities is too political for you, I also believe that there's a personal lesson we can take from it. Jesus does not leave the scene of either of these healings before making a human connection with the person he healed, listening to the woman's story, and seeing that Jairus' daughter got something to eat. And so while we cannot heal others with a touch, as Jesus did, we can certainly follow his example by connecting. Like Jesus, we can prioritize listening to the stories of those we encounter rather than perpetually hastening on to the next thing. And even when we lack the resources to meet someone's need for food, shelter, or healing, we can help them to ask others for what they need. And furthermore, the church is made of people who have connected to each other in worship, fellowship, and service. And so it is in loving connection with others in whatever small ways that the church can grow. And especially after the disruption of the pandemic, loneliness is endemic in our society. And as former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy points out, loneliness can be a significant underlying factor in a number of conditions affecting a person's mental and physical health. And so, a simple act of connection with another human being very well may be an act of healing, both for them and for us. And it's through repeated connections and invitations that the church embraces others. And therefore, as odd as Jesus' priorities in this story may seem, we would do well to follow his example and prioritize connecting with others as we perform triage with the limited hours that we have every day. Amen.